in the gold-leafed silence of the Astoria Grand, where the chime of crystal glasses was softer than a breath and vast sums of money changed hands without anyone noticing. A young waitress glided through the banquet tables like a shadow. No one turned to look. No one asked her name. That winter night, inside the restaurant warmed by the aroma of decades-aged wine and seared scallops, snow fell slowly outside the tall windows. For guests in tailored suits and evening gowns worth more than a year's income for many, this was an oasis of privilege. But for the staff, it was a gilded cage. Isabella Caldwell had grown used to living like a ghost here, back straight, hair in a tight bun, face betraying not a flicker of emotion. At only 26, she could pour rare Bordeaux without spilling a drop, describe the flavor profile of a dish in 3 languages, and anticipate a guest's needs before they even spoke. In their eyes, she was just a pleasant, efficient, and completely forgettable waitress after dessert. But no one knew the story behind those calm gray eyes. 3 years ago, Isabella was a graduate student in economics at Rosenfeld University, ready to step into a promising career path. Her father, Dr. Nathaniel Caldwell, a gifted biochemist but too trusting of others, had spent his life building Caldwell Biosolutions, a company with a revolutionary water purification technology designed to serve communities around the world, until it was stolen. A ruthless financial conglomerate, Whitford Capital, launched a hostile takeover exploiting legal loopholes, spreading rumors that the technology was flawed, driving the company's value into freefall. They bought it for a pittance, sold off the assets, erased all ownership records, leaving her father with crushing debt and a broken heart. The shock caused him to suffer a stroke, paralyzing half his body. Isabella abandoned her doctoral dissertation to care for him full-time. Medical bills piled up. Debt from the corporate sabotage clung tight. And so the woman once hailed as the financial prodigy of Rosenfeld found herself wearing a waitress's uniform, surviving on tips from the very kind of people who had destroyed her family. Astoria Grand was the highest-paying job she could get if she was willing to pay the price in self-respect. Each night, she locked her past away in the small locker of the staff room, beside her worn copy of Keynes's economics book. She stepped out with her hair pinned high, her white shirt crisply pressed, and became the ghostly server once again. But tonight would be different. At exactly 8:00 p.m., the doors swung open, the air seemed to thicken. 2 men entered, carrying with them the kind of presence that commanded the entire room's attention. Leading was Richard Whitford, nearly 60, with silver hair and eyes cold as steel, a name synonymous with ruthless acquisitions. Behind him was Evan Mercer, younger, with the restless eyes of someone eager to please the boss at any cost. Manager Jean-Luc Moreau, usually composed, seemed to shrink. "Mr. Whitford, your usual table is ready." "I hope so." Whitford replied without even glancing at him. They were led to the corner table with a panoramic city view, the table reserved only for the gods of the financial world. Isabella approached, water bottle in hand, her voice soft but firm. "Good evening, gentlemen." Still or sparkling water, Whitford didn't answer. Evan looked up. "Sparkling." 2 bottles. As she poured, they spoke in English about a recently optimized deal, a polite term for mass layoffs. Whitford smirked. Corporate culture doesn't belong on a balance sheet. Ruthless. But it didn't pierce her composure. Then, the tone shifted to precise, icy German. Look at her! That pretty little waitress can't be too bright." Isabella understood every word. Her hand stayed steady as she set down the breadbasket. On the outside, she was the image of professionalism. But inside, an old fire was beginning to flare the feeling of being dismissed, reduced to an object. She told herself, "I can endure this. I've endured worse." But she didn't know. Within minutes, they would mention a name, Northstar, the code name for the deal that had destroyed her father's career and health. And when that happened, the ghost of the Astoria Grand would no longer remain silent. If you want to hear the rest of Isabella's story, how she faced the man who had ruined her family right at his dinner table, subscribe to the Soft Why so you won't miss the next chapter. From the corner table, the soft clink of glasses blended with the distant murmur of the Astoria Grand. But for Isabella, every sound around her began to blur when a single word struck her ear: Northstar. Evan Mercer had just mentioned it, his voice lowered but still clear enough for her to hear. The name pierced through the calm facade she had struggled to maintain for the past 3 years like a dagger. Northstar, the code name for the deal, had stolen everything from her father. Isabella lowered her head, continuing the ritual of pouring wine as if unbothered. Under the warm golden lights, the deep crimson of the Petrus flowed evenly into the decanter. Each drop was worth more than a month's worth of her father's care expenses back then. The paradox made her throat tighten. Richard Whitford slowly swirled his glass, the aroma of the wine rising and mixing with his low chuckle. "Northstar is a masterpiece," he said in German, his voice full of self-satisfaction. That old man Caldwell, such a naive fool, believed every word we told him. A shockwave rippled through Isabella's body. She stayed steady, still smiling like the perfect server, but inside, her heart pounded fast, each beat urging her forward. Evan laughed along. He was always going on about ethics, about the good of humanity, as if that could pay the bills. Exactly. Whitford nodded, setting his glass down. A few leaked rumors about technical issues and a fake report, and the investors panicked. When we made the buyout offer, they practically paid us to take the company off their hands. Isabella swallowed the anger rising in her chest. She thought of her father, the man who read her poetry before bed, who once pointed out constellations in the summer sky. And now, he was being called a fool by the very man who had destroyed his life's work. Evan leaned toward Whitford. The best part was convincing his head of Randy Peterson to sign a statement saying the technology would fail in 5 years. Whitford burst out laughing. A perfect lie. That was the final nail in the coffin. Isabella kept pouring, keeping her eyes averted, but her mind raced through images her father in his wheelchair, his eyes vacant. The hands that had once crafted formulas to save millions now trembling too much to hold a pen. When the ritual was complete, she gently set the decanter on the table. Not a single drop spilled, not a single extra sound. But inside, a thin layer of ice was cracking, revealing something cold and sharp beneath. Whitford leaned back in his chair and picked up his water glass. "Look at her," he continued in German, "probably worried most about whether her tips this month will cover rent." Evan snorted. "The less you worry, the easier life is. Only those who have been belittled know that feeling, that sense of being reduced to a decorative object in someone else's story. For Isabella, this wasn't just about her father anymore. It was the wound of everyone forced to bow to power just to survive. She took a deep breath, steadying her emotions. Her father had passed away 6 months ago. This job was no longer a sacrifice to support him. It was just a gilded cage. And now, the one who had locked her inside was sitting right in front of her. The steak was brought over by another server. Isabella stepped forward, placing the plates in front of Whitford. Then Evan. Her hands were steady as stone, but this time, she didn't walk away immediately. She stood tall, her gaze fixed directly on Whitford. "Is there a problem?" he asked, irritation in his voice. Isabella felt a strange calm spread through her. A calm that comes to those who have decided to sink the ship and drag their enemy down with it. She lowered her voice, but made it clear, speaking in the precise German of the Rosenfeld region. "Yes, Mr. Whitford, there is a problem." The air seemed to still. The fork in Whitford's hand froze midair. Evan nearly choked on his wine. The scattered conversations around them seemed to vanish, leaving a space where only the three of them existed. Isabella looked straight into Whitford's eyes. For the first time that evening, he truly saw her. The atmosphere at the dining table froze the moment Isabella spoke. Whitford kept his fork suspended, his eyes cold as if he could crush her with a glance. Evan Mercer quickly set down his wineglass, unable to hide his discomfort. Isabella didn't look away. Her voice, in German, rang out low and sharp, like a blade slicing through a curtain of arrogance. "First of all, allow me to correct your grammar. One does not say the brain of the goldfish the way you just did, but rather des goldfishes." A faint, mocking smile brushed her lips, but her eyes remained icy. The diners at the neighboring tables, though they didn't understand the language, clearly sensed the undercurrent running beneath the velvet air. Whitford blinked. The initial shock quickly gave way to a flush of purple rage. "Who do you think you are?" he growled in English. Isabella did not switch languages, forcing him to listen in German. "You want to know who I am? I'm not just someone relying on tips to pay rent. I graduated at the top of my class in economics from Rosenfeld University, and I'm the daughter of the man you referred to tonight as the fool, Dr. Nathaniel Caldwell." A wave of silence rolled through the VIP section. Whitford leaned back in his chair, his face relaxing for a split second before tightening again. He understood immediately. Isabella stepped closer, each word nailing itself to the table. "I heard everything about how you fabricated false news, bribed the man my father treated like a son, and used him to destroy my father's company. You didn't just steal technology, you killed the spirit of a man." The final sentence landed like a hammer blow. Evan Mercer's face reddened as he glanced around. Some guests had abandoned their own conversations to listen in. Jean-Luc Moreau, the manager, was making his way over from across the room, his gaze assessing. Whitford clenched his fists, his voice dropping into a growl. "You're destroying yourself here." "I will," Isabella cut him off, her tone still calm but carrying the weight of 3 years of pain. "You destroyed my family. And tonight, you're sitting here drinking a bottle of Petrus worth $5,000 as if it were tap water. I have nothing left to lose. Mr. Whitford, nothing." Whitford glanced around and caught the curious, cool stares from other tables. A powerful billionaire was being cornered by a waitress. Evan tried to interject, "This is a private matter. No need." Isabella turned to him, her gaze razor sharp. This is not private. This is the truth. And tonight, it has been spoken. Jean-Luc Moreau appeared at the table, his tone polite but firm. Is there a problem here? Whitford was made to stand abruptly, but Moreau kept his eyes on Isabella. Miss Caldwell, are you all right? Isabella drew in a deep breath, then answered in her steady server's voice, Yes, Mr. Moreau, I'm simply settling an old bill, with words. A few soft chuckles rose from nearby tables, mingled with the pause of silverware midair. Whitford could feel the weight of those stares pressing on him. He shoved his chair back so hard the table shook. You will never work in New York again, he spat. Moreau stepped forward half a pace, his voice steel under silk. Mr. Whitford, she is my employee. Here, we do not allow customers to insult or threaten our staff. If anyone is to leave, it will be you. A small collective. Oh, rippled through the room. Whitford glared but said nothing more. He threw several bills onto the table, snatched his coat, and strode out. Evan scrambled to follow. The door shut. For a moment, the Astoria Grand returned to its soft golden light and gentle background music. But a new current had entered the air, one of witness and respect. A few light claps broke out. Not loud, but enough for Isabella to know that the silence of the past 3 years had been shattered. The glass doors of Astoria Grand closed behind Richard Whitford and Evan Mercer, leaving behind a strange stillness inside. The gentle background music resumed, but across the tables, glances were still being exchanged, part surprise, part satisfaction, as if they had just witnessed one of those rare moments when power was overturned. Isabella could still feel her heartbeat pounding, but her calm exterior had returned. She cleared the plates and glasses from the empty table as if the confrontation earlier had been just another small part of her shift. In truth, she knew she had just crossed a line from which she could never step back. Jean-Luc Moreau approached, his voice deep yet gentle. You did something very few people dare to do, Isabella. She nodded slightly. I know there will be consequences. Maybe, he replied, his gaze steady. But sometimes consequences are a fair price to reclaim your dignity. In the corner of the room, a woman in her 40s, with neatly cut brown hair, had been watching the entire scene. That was Catherine Doyle, a veteran investigative journalist from the New York Sentinel. At first, she had only come to Astoria Grand to meet a confidential source. But after a few minutes of observing, Catherine had pulled out her phone and recorded nearly the entire exchange, including the moment Whitford stormed off in anger. Catherine didn't understand German, but she knew power and confrontation when she saw it. And more than that, she recognized a big story. That night, back home, Isabella opened her closet, took out an old handbag, and slipped inside it a worn copy of Keynes's economics book, along with her uniform that still carried the scent of expensive cologne from the guests. Stepping outside, the snow was still falling, but for the first time in years, she drew in a deep breath without having to hold anything back. She didn't know that just a few hours later, news of the confrontation would begin to leak out. Catherine Doyle had already messaged her editor. There was an incident at Astoria Grand tonight. Whitford was confronted by a waitress right at the table, in front of dozens of witnesses. I need to dig deeper into a name, Caldwell Biosolutions. The next morning, Isabella woke to the phone ringing nonstop. Messages came in from her colleagues at the restaurant, mixed with unknown numbers. Some sent her a link to the headline now on the New York Sentinel's front page, Billionaire Richard Whitford and the Truth Challenged at Astoria Grand. Catherine's article didn't just recount the events of the previous night. It delved into the history of Whitford Capital's acquisitions. In just one night, she had unearthed old documents, scattered news clippings about Northstar, and even company records of Caldwell Biosolutions. The piece painted a portrait of Dr. Nathaniel Caldwell as a man devoted to science and the community, standing in stark contrast to a cold, ruthless Richard Whitford. Isabella read it from beginning to end, feeling both proud and overwhelmed. This was no longer just her story. It had become a moral test for society at large. On social media, the hashtag #Waitress vs Whitford began trending. A grainy video clip from the corner of the room, showing Isabella standing tall and looking Whitford straight in the eye, was shared tens of thousands of times. Comments flooded in. So brave. This is David and Goliath in modern times. By noon, as Isabella was still avoiding reporters outside her building, a new email arrived. The sender, David Liang, CEO of Summit Horizons, a well-known investment group committed to sustainable and ethical projects. Dear Ms. Caldwell, I knew your father and deeply admired his work. I also read this morning's article and was very impressed by the way you stood up to Whitford. We are opening a new division focused on community-serving technology investments. You have knowledge in economics, understand technology, and, most importantly, have clear ethical principles. If you are interested, I would like to meet to discuss a leadership position. Sincerely, David Liang. Isabella sat still in front of the screen. For the past 3 years, she had lived only to survive. Now, another door was opening not out of pity, but because of her own actions. She drew in a deep breath and touched her father's name on the cover of the old book. Dad, maybe I've found a way to continue your work. 2 days after that fateful email, Isabella met with David Liang. She stepped into the towering glass building of Summit Horizons with the feeling that she was crossing into another life. Instead of the familiar black and white uniform of the Astoria Grand, today she wore a simple navy suit, her hair loosely down. Each step echoed against the marble floor like a new heartbeat. David greeted her in the lobby. He wasn't the kind of CEO who stayed hidden behind a long desk. Instead, he shook her hand firmly, his gaze steady yet warm. Ms. Caldwell, thank you for coming. I didn't just read about what happened at the Astoria Grand. I also read your old research papers. Isabella looked slightly surprised. You read them? Of course. David smiled. The way you analyzed the connection between sustainable development and long-term profit, that's exactly what we need here. In the glass-walled conference room on the 35th floor, midday light spilled across the long table. David placed a folder in front of her. These are the startup projects we're considering. The goal of this new division is to identify technology that can create social change while remaining financially viable. I want you to lead this team. Isabella flipped through the pages on sustainable agriculture, biodegradable materials, and affordable healthcare. Each project touched a part of her mind she had long neglected. Why trust me with this position, she asked, her voice low but sincere. David leaned on the table, his eyes serious. Because I see in you something many well-educated people lack. A principle that cannot be bought. Your father had it, and I believe you do too. Here, how we make money matters just as much as how much we make. A brief silence followed. Isabella thought of her father. His face lit with passion as he spoke about how a drop of clean water could save a child's life somewhere far away. She looked up and nodded slightly. I accept. 4 weeks later, Isabella Caldwell was no longer the ghost of the Astoria Grand. She was the director of the Social Technology Investment Division at Summit Horizons. Her corner office overlooked all of Manhattan. Instead of serving, she now listened to founders pitch their ideas and decided who would receive the funding to turn those ideas into reality. The first project she chose was a startup run by 2 young engineers developing biodegradable polymers to replace single-use plastics. Their presentation was clumsy, but their science was exceptional. Isabella saw in them a reflection of her father. Technically brilliant, but without a shield against predatory investors. She stepped in to protect the project, structuring the deal so they retained control of their technology. When the contract was signed, one of the engineers said, his voice thick with emotion, "Thank you for believing in us. Without you, we would have sold it cheaply just to survive." Isabella simply smiled. Keep your promise to your technology. That's the only way to survive. While she was busy with her new work, the storm outside had not yet cleared for Richard Whitford. The New York Sentinel article had triggered an official investigation. The Securities and Exchange Commission began digging through the Northstar case files. His former partners, including Peterson, were called in for questioning one by one. One late evening, when the office was empty, Isabella received an unfamiliar call. The man's voice on the other end sounded weary. "Ms. Caldwell, this is Evan Mercer." She leaned back in her chair, remaining silent. I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness. I just want to say I lost everything after that night, but I think I deserved it. You were right. Redemption isn't in what you say. It's in what you do afterward. Isabella stayed quiet for a few more seconds, then replied, her voice soft but firm. If you truly believe that, use the rest of your life to do something good. That's all. The call ended, leaving her with a strange feeling, not triumph, but the sense of a circle closing. One March morning, the pale sunlight streamed through the glass windows of Isabella's 35th floor office. On her desk, among stacks of files for new projects, lay a folder marked in red with legal documents concerning the water filtration technology patents of Caldwell Biosolutions. For weeks, she had been quietly working to reclaim what belonged to her father. When Whitford Capital was pulled into an investigation, many of its assets were frozen or put up for sale to salvage liquidity. And in that list, she saw a familiar name. Her father's patents appraised at a fraction of their true worth and about to be sold to a private overseas water extraction company. Isabella could not allow that to happen. In the conference room with Summit Horizons' legal team, she spread out a map of her plan. We're going to buy back these patents not to monopolize profit, but to place them in a public trust. The goal is to license them at low cost to nonprofit organizations and governments in need of clean water solutions. One lawyer looked up. This will almost certainly make Whitford realize you're behind it. Isabella gave a faint smile. I don't care. This belongs to my father and to the world, not locked away in some predator's safe. David Liang, seated at the head of the table, had been silent, observing. Then he nodded. Do it. This is exactly why I wanted you in this position. The deal moved faster than expected. Whitford Capital, mired in chaos, agreed to relinquish the patents for only a fraction of their real value. When the contract was signed, Isabella sat still for a moment, her hand resting on the page bearing her signature. A warm wave washed over her, not the loud triumph of revenge, but the quiet return of a stolen piece of her soul. Immediately, she established the Nathaniel Caldwell Clean Water Fund, placing all the patents under open access with conditions to safeguard their humanitarian purpose. When the press release went out, headlines read, "Water filtration technology, once stolen, returns to serve the public." That afternoon, Isabella stopped by the nursing home where her father had spent his final years. The manager recognized her instantly at the door and hugged her tightly. "Mr. Caldwell would be so proud." You know, Isabella stepped into her father's old room. The bed was empty, but in the corner, the white orchid he had kept was now wilted. She sat down, running her hand gently over a photograph of him smiling on an old award stage. "I did it, Dad," she whispered. "Your work will save lives, just like you always wanted." Work at Summit Horizons grew busier. Yet in between project evaluations, Isabella kept hearing news about Richard Whitford. The investigation had shifted into the criminal phase. Former allies turned on him one by one, offering evidence to save themselves. One late evening, with the city lights glowing outside, she received a short email from an unfamiliar address. "I hear you reclaimed the technology. I assume that was your goal from the start. Either way, I hope you're happy with this victory. R. Bu." She read it, then deleted it instantly. No reply. To her, this was not a personal victory, nor was it revenge. It was simply justice, the kind that should never have been lost. A month later, when the biopolymer project she had championed officially launched, Isabella stood on stage beside its two young founders. In the audience, David Leong watched her with pride. Reporters fired questions until one voice rose above the rest. "Ms. Caldwell, if you ever met Richard Whitford again, what would you say?" She paused for a beat, then smiled softly. "I wouldn't say anything. I'd offer him a glass of clean water filtered through my father's technology, so he remembers there are some kinds of power that can't be bought." The room fell silent for a moment before erupting into applause. Isabella bowed, feeling it deep in her heart that this was no longer a story about the past. It was the beginning of a future she had shaped with her own hands. On a late spring evening, Manhattan lit up brilliantly. From the high-floor office of Summit Horizons, Isabella stood by the glass window, watching the ribbons of light stretch out like the living veins of the city. She remembered the years at Astoria Grand, her own silhouette gliding between dining tables, moving silently as if she didn't exist. Now, those same feet had carried her to a place where her voice could make change happen. On her desk, a stack of neatly arranged files for new projects awaited. Each file was an opportunity to change the lives of thousands. She had met young founders from faraway places, listened to them speak about their first well, their first classroom, their first product. Every story was a perfect piece in extending her father's legacy. One afternoon, Isabella accepted an invitation to return to Astoria Grand, this time, not as an employee. Manager Jean-Luc Moreau greeted her right at the door, his smile as warm as ever. "Welcome back, Miss Caldwell. Tonight, the corner table is yours." She sat down and ordered a simple meal. When the young waitress placed the glass of water on the table, Isabella noticed the mix of worry and determination in the girl's eyes, the same look Isabella herself had carried 3 years earlier. Isabella smiled. "Thank you. And remember, this job doesn't define who you are." The waitress gave a small nod, a faint smile spreading across her face. News about Richard Whitford still appeared from time to time, but only as a distant echo. His trial drew public attention, and every piece of evidence from the Northstar case shut down any chance of his return. Isabella didn't seek the feeling of victory. She only felt relieved that the whirlwind of injustice had finally closed. One morning, as she was preparing for a conference on sustainable investment, she caught her own reflection in the mirror. Not the girl bracing herself to endure anymore, but a woman who knew exactly where she stood and what was worth protecting. That evening, on her way home, she stopped by a small park. On a bench near the fountain, a little boy was playing with a mini water filter, a new product from the Clean Water Fund named after her father. His mother explained that this was the first time their family could use clean water without buying it in bottles. Isabella froze for a moment, then smiled. Her father, though gone, was still present in every drop of this water. As night fell over the city, Isabella knew this story wasn't an ending. Every new project, every person gaining access to clean technology, every founder protected from people like Whitford, it was all just beginning. She walked through the night streets, her footsteps blending into the city's bustling rhythm, her heart lighter than it had ever been. She had found her voice again, and this time, she would never lose it. If this story of courage, justice, and perseverance touched you, subscribe to The Soft Why to hear more truly inspiring journeys where one voice can change the entire world